Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. When you think of Voldemort, you probably picture a single villain, the embodiment of darkness and fear. But he was never alone. Behind him stood the Death Eaters, loyal, fanatical, and fearless. Among them were Bellatrix Lestrange, Barty Crouch Jr., and Lucius Malfoy. Their names have long become synonymous with evil, but also with fascination. How was their organization structured? What did it mean to be a Death Eater? It wasn't just about masks and spells, it was a path, an ideology, a code, and today I'll tell you about it. Enjoy the video. Number 1, absolute obedience to orders. A Death Eater does not ask questions, they obey, they execute. That's what Voldemort valued above all else: loyalty, submission, fear of his wrath. Remember when Lucius Malfoy hesitated as the Dark Lord demanded his wand? His trembling didn't go unnoticed. Narcissa whispered frantically for him to comply. But Bellatrix, she followed orders blindly, even when she didn't know what exactly she was guarding in her vault. Because Voldemort's law was clear: don't think, just obey. Number 2, never say Voldemort's name. A name carries power and fear. The world called him he who must not be named. The Death Eaters whispered instead, the Dark Lord. The Master, even Snape, balancing dangerously between loyalty and betrayal, always said, the Dark Lord. The name Tom Riddle, it was taboo. His true name was forbidden. To the Death Eaters, he was more than a man. He was a symbol. And blasphemy wasn't just a mistake. It was a death sentence. Number 3, eliminate those who reject the Dark Lord's ideology. You're either with us or against us. As simple as the Avada Kedavra curse. Voldemort tolerated no doubt. If you opposed his vision, blood purity, magical superiority, rule through fear, you became the enemy, even if it was your own brother or your father. Swearing allegiance to the Dark Lord meant making a choice not only for yourself, but for your entire family. And it was a dangerous choice because Voldemort demanded absolute devotion. Number 4, inducting children into the organization. Becoming a Death Eater wasn't always a matter of personal belief. Sometimes it was a matter of bloodline. Voldemort knew if you want to build an empire, start with young minds. That's why Draco Malfoy was tasked with killing Dumbledore, not as a teenager, as a weapon. Crabbe and Goyle are other examples. Their fathers were Death Eaters, and their sons followed suit. It wasn't just tradition, it was initiation. Number 5, sending children to Hogwarts. Strangely enough, Voldemort respected Hogwarts. He hated some of its teachers. He despised Dumbledore, but the school itself? He saw it as a powerful tool. Even during the height of the rebellion, the children of Death Eaters continued their studies there. Why? Because a school of magic shapes more than just knowledge. It shapes ideology. Voldemort wanted his followers to be strong, clever, well-trained, even if that meant sending them into the lion's den. Number 6, infiltrating the Ministry of Magic. One of Voldemort's main strategies was to seize power from within. The Ministry of Magic was the perfect target. Through influence, connections, and wealth, the Death Eaters slipped in. They waited, they endured, they pretended, and then now they struck. Once the minister became a puppet, seemingly legal Death Eaters like Yaxley took control of key departments. It wasn't war, it was a chess game, cold, calculated, merciless. Number 7, black robes as a symbol. A uniform is more than just fabric. It's a declaration of belonging. Death Eaters wore dark robes, not just for aesthetics. It was a visual extension of Voldemort himself. He wore long, regal garments. They wore tight, similar but less majestic ones. Even here, the hierarchy was clear. He was the king. They were knights of darkness. Wearing bright colors would be treason. Only darkness. Only cold. Number 8, never doubt blood purity. Bellatrix. Lestrange never questioned blood. She lived by it, breathed it. You should be proud, she told Narcissa. Your son will help cleanse the school of filth. In her eyes, Muggle-borns were beneath animals, and any Death Eater who showed tolerance was already suspect. Even Snape, despite his skill, was never fully trusted by her. She called him the half-blood prince with disgust, reminding everyone of his tainted lineage. Yet Snape survived, not by blood, but by obedience. He never spoke against the creed. He insulted Muggle-borns, punished them, watched them bleed. That silence was his shield. Voldemort himself was a half-blood, but he never acknowledged it. "I am Lord Voldemort," he declared, rearranging the letters of Tom Marvolo Riddle. The Riddle name was buried, forgotten. He demanded purity from his followers, even if he couldn't claim it himself. That was the law. Hypocrisy didn't matter, only loyalty. Any Death Eater caught sympathizing with Muggle-borns faced immediate consequences. Lucius Malfoy once tried to protest the use of the Cruciatus curse on a young student. Voldemort silenced him with a glance. Doubt in blood purity wasn't a difference of opinion, it was treason. Number 9, the Dark Mark is mandatory. The Dark Mark burned. That was the signal. No letters, no meetings, just pain. When Voldemort returned, Severus Snape felt it first. "It's getting stronger," he told Dumbledore, hiding the truth beneath calm words. Every Death Eater knew the feeling, the searing fire on the left forearm. Lucius Malfoy clutched his arm in the graveyard, eyes wide with fear. The mark meant more than loyalty, it meant ownership. Voldemort didn't ask for volunteers, he summoned them. And they came, not because they wanted to, but because the mark demanded it. To refuse the mark was to die, to hide it was worse. Karkaroff tried, he ran, he begged, he showed his mark to the Wizengamot as a warning. "It's fading!" he cried. But Voldemort found him. His body was discovered in a shack, the mark still fresh on his arm. Even in death, it burned. That was the price. The mark was not just a tattoo, it was a curse, a promise, a brand. And once given, it could never be removed. Number 10, always have spies among enemies. Severus Snape was the perfect spy. He stood in Dumbledore's office, drank tea with the Order of the Phoenix, and still carried the dark mark beneath his sleeve. Every conversation, every glance, every silence, calculated. Voldemort trusted him not because of warmth, but because of usefulness. Snape delivered. He passed on Dumbledore's plans, watched Harry Potter from within the castle walls, and reported every whisper. "You are a talented liar," Dumbledore once said, but even he couldn't be sure which side Snape truly served until the very end. That was the power of a good infiltrator. Voldemort expected no less. Barty Crouch Jr. took infiltration to a terrifying extreme. Using Polyjuice Potion, he spent nearly a year disguised as Alastor Moody, one of the most respected auras in the wizarding world. No one suspected him. He manipulated the Triwizard Tournament, placed Harry directly in Voldemort's trap, and nearly delivered the boy for slaughter. "It was I who broke into your office," he confessed later. "It was I who put your name in the Goblet of Fire." His success proved one thing. One man inside enemy lines could do more damage than an army outside them. Voldemort prized information over firepower. He knew that battles are won before the first spell is cast. That's why he placed spies not just in the Ministry but in Hogwarts, in the press, and even in families. Some Pogiratels posed as allies for years, like Augustus Rookwood in the Department of Mysteries. His secrets helped shape the war. The rule was simple: strike when unseen, speak when unheard, and vanish before the world knows you were ever there. Number 11, respect snakes and serpent symbolism. Nagini slithered at Voldemort's side like a shadow given life. She wasn't a pet, she was a symbol, a constant reminder of power, control, and death. When Charity Burbage pleaded for her life, begging Severus please, Voldemort didn't speak. He simply whispered, "Nagini, dinner." No hesitation. no humanity. The message was clear. Snakes were sacred in his world. They didn't just kill, they judged. To disrespect a snake was to insult Voldemort's own nature. The serpent wasn't a beast, it was an extension of the Dark Lord himself. Death Eaters wore snakes not just on their arms, but in their beliefs. The dark mark itself, skull and serpent, wasn't random, it was a covenant. Bellatrix had serpent rings and embroidered black robes trimmed with scales. Even the decor in Malfoy Manor during Voldemort's occupation reflected this reverence. Carved serpents, twisting chandeliers, a cold-blooded elegance. Anyone mocking the symbolism risked more than offence. Voldemort saw meaning in every hiss. He was a Parselmouth, a speaker of their ancient tongue. That gift wasn't shared, it was feared. And those who served him learned to fear the serpent too. When a younger recruit once flinched at Nagini's approach, Voldemort noticed. The boy, a distant cousin of the Rosier, tried to hide it, but fear had already taken root. Bellatrix laughed. "He fears your queen, my lord." The Dark Lord said nothing. The next night, the boy was gone. No ceremony, no explanation. Among the Death Eaters, that was warning enough. If you could not kneel before a serpent, you could not stand beside Voldemort. Number 12. Show no sympathy for the enemy. Draco Malfoy stood on the astronomy tower, wand trembling. Across from him, Albus Dumbledore, unarmed, weakened, waiting. Draco had every reason to cast the curse, his family's safety, his life, Voldemort's command. But he hesitated. He couldn't do it. "You're not a killer," Dumbledore whispered, and Draco proved him right. That moment of weakness cost him more than his pride. Voldemort saw it, the failure, the mercy. From that night on, Draco was no longer trusted. The task was passed to Snape. The Dark Lord had no room for compassion. Bellatrix Lestrange would have spat on the very idea. Mercy, to her, was filth. She took pleasure in cruelty because it proved strength. When she tortured Hermione Granger at Malfoy Manor, she didn't hesitate. No remorse, no pause, just rage. "You filthy little mudblood," she hissed, slicing into Hermione's skin. For Bellatrix, pity was a disease. She believed that only through pain and dominance could one truly serve the Dark Lord. Anyone who questioned that truth didn't belong. Snape knew the danger of sympathy. Every step he took was a balancing act between two masters. But even he couldn't allow emotion to surface. When he killed Dumbledore, he silenced the part of himself that remembered Lily. He couldn't hesitate, couldn't shake. Avada Kedavra. The curse flew without a tremor. To falter would have been fatal. Voldemort expected that level of control. Even love, even grief, had to be hidden, buried deep. Death Eaters didn't cry, they didn't beg, and they never forgave. Pity wasn't just a weakness, it was betrayal. The moment a Death Eater felt sorry for a blood traitor or a Muggle-born, he opened the door to ruin. Voldemort demanded coldness, obedience without heart. When Regulus Black began questioning the killing, he sealed his own fate. When Narcissa Malfoy lied to Voldemort about Harry's death to protect her son, she committed silent treason. If he had known, she would have died on the spot. No excuses, no mercy. Sympathy had no place in the Dark Lord's world. Number 13, be ready to sacrifice yourself. Barty Crouch Jr. didn't hesitate. When the Auras stormed the Lestrange home, he stood beside Bellatrix and Rabastan, unflinching. His crime, torturing Frank and Alice Longbottom, was horrific, but in his eyes it was loyalty. "The Dark Lord will rise again. We will be rewarded," Bellatrix screamed at the courtroom, and Barty stood silent but proud. He went to Azkaban not as a broken man, but as a martyr. Even when his own father disowned him, Barty clung to the belief that Voldemort would return. Years later, when he escaped and lived as Mad-Eye Moody for an entire school year, he did so knowing he might never live freely again. It didn't matter. He acted for Voldemort. He was ready to die for him. True loyalty wasn't measured by survival, it was measured by sacrifice. Regulus Black, the younger brother of Sirius, made the fatal choice to betray Voldemort from within. But before he turned against the Dark Lord, he had already proven how far he was willing to go. When Voldemort asked for a house elf to test his Horcrux defenses, Regulus offered Kreacher, and when Kreacher returned broken and near dead, Regulus said nothing. He knew the risk. Yet he continued wearing the mark, pretending, waiting. When he finally drank the potion in the cave and faced the Inferi, he died alone, without fame, without reward. But he died obeying the deepest law of Voldemort's army: give everything. Even lesser-known Death Eaters followed the rule. Mulciber and Rookwood accepted their fate in Azkaban with grim resolve. No plea bargains, no testimonies, just silence. Because to speak against the Dark Lord was to lose your soul, even if your body survived. Voldemort respected that kind of loyalty. He didn't reward cowardice. When he returned, those who had stayed faithful, like Avery and Nott, were welcomed back. Those who had tried to cut deals, they were punished. "You ask for forgiveness?" Voldemort whispered. "I do not forgive. I punish." The moment a Death Eater took the mark, he signed away his future. Life, safety, even family. None of it mattered anymore. Bellatrix laughed in the Department of Mysteries as spells flew past her face, not because she wanted to live, but because she wanted to win. "He will not be conquered," she screamed. Death was not the end for her. It was glory. That was the standard. That was the price. And anyone who hesitated at the edge of that cliff never truly served Voldemort. Number 14. Avoid friendships with Muggles or Muggle-borns. Draco Malfoy sat in the Hogwarts Express, cold eyes fixed on the hallway outside his compartment. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione passed by, he barely moved, but when Hermione spoke, his lip curled with practiced disgust. "I don't think they should let the other sort in, do you?" he had said, in the Sorcerer's Stone, already echoing the pure blood doctrine. Yet few noticed how strained that disgust sometimes looked. Draco had grown up surrounded by other pure blood families, but even he knew that being friendly with Muggleborns wasn't just frowned upon. It was dangerous. It could get you punished. It could make you a traitor. A Death Eater was expected to sever ties with anyone Voldemort labelled inferior, not just in public, in thought, in feeling, in memory. If you had a friend who was Muggle-born, you cut them off. If you had feelings for one, you buried them. Blood came before all. Even Sirius Black, though he rejected his family's ideology, remembered the scorn he faced for befriending James Potter, a blood traitor. "My mother thought blood purity was everything," Sirius once told Harry. "She blasted me off the family tree." For Death Eaters, such betrayal wasn't met with banishment. It was met with torture, exposure, or death. Regulus Black, Sirius's younger brother, once tried to live by Voldemort's rules. He kept close to purebloods, followed the code, spoke the right words. But when he saw what Voldemort did to Kreacher, the creature Regulus actually cared about, he broke. He realized what loyalty meant in that world, loyalty to cruelty, not to love, not to family, and certainly not to compassion. Regulus turned against Voldemort in secret, and he died for it. A single act of care made him a traitor. The rules were simple. Do not befriend Muggles. Do not speak kindly of Muggle-borns. If someone shows you kindness, forget it. Replace it with contempt. Bellatrix Lestrange once caught Andromeda, her own sister, in a relationship with a Muggle-born. The shame burned her so deeply she considered her sister dead. "She is no longer my sister," Bellatrix hissed in the Deathly Hallows. "She has chosen her side." The message was clear. You were either loyal to the blood or you were nothing. Number 15. Maintain an atmosphere of fear. The black sky over the Quidditch World Cup burned with the unnatural green of the dark mark. A skull with a serpent tongue twisted above the terrified crowd. searing itself into their memories far deeper than any hex. That single image, glowing over the ruins of joy, was not just a symbol of death. It was a message. The Death Eaters had returned, and they brought with them the oldest magic of all, fear. Voldemort understood that a fearful world was easier to control than a free one. He drilled into his followers not just loyalty or ruthlessness, but the art of terror. Every appearance had to be unforgettable, every movement, every spell, every silence, calculated for maximum horror. A Death Eater was not just a killer. He was a legend in motion. Bellatrix Lestrange embodied this philosophy perfectly. Her madness was not a weakness, it was a weapon. When she murdered Sirius Black in the Department of Mysteries, it wasn't just an act of revenge or battle. It was a theatrical display of cruelty engineered to unnerve her enemies. She laughed as he disappeared through the veil, and that laughter echoed long after the fight ended. The point was not merely to win, it was to haunt. As Dumbledore later said, fear of a name increases fear of the thing itself. Bellatrix made sure her name was more feared than her wand. Parents whispered of her in front of fireplaces, hoping their children never crossed her path. In Azkaban she had been locked away, but even then her legacy crawled like a shadow across the wizarding world. The Lestranges, the Carrows, the Malfoys, each served the Dark Lord in their own way, but all followed one golden rule: they must be remembered in terror. Amicus Carrow, when placed in Hogwarts during the regime under Snape, punished students with such merciless precision that even brave Gryffindors preferred silence over rebellion. His sister Alecto revelled in her position, treating Muggle studies as an indoctrination class, twisting education into psychological warfare. Together they turned learning into a battlefield and ensured that the very halls of Hogwarts, once a place of safety, reeked of dread. No child under their eyes was ever truly at ease. Every corner might hide a punishment, every whisper might be betrayal. Even magic lost its comfort when fear lived in every wand flick. The Death Eaters didn't always need to kill to spread panic. Sometimes just the appearance of a black-robed figure was enough. Travers, after the fall of the Ministry, would appear in Diagon Alley, his mask gleaming, his silence speaking louder than any threat. Shops closed, families disappeared indoors. No curses needed. The message was already clear. The Dark Lord's will extended into every inch of life. The silence around Travers was not respect, it was terror. Children tugged at their mothers' robes, old men pretended not to see. Travers left behind no bodies, but many sleepless nights. Voldemort understood that this kind of psychological warfare was more effective than any killing curse. The brutal execution of Charity Burbage, the Hogwarts Muggle Studies professor, in Malfoy Manor, was not just about her ideology. It was spectacle. Voldemort levitated her over the table as his followers dined beneath her like wolves. He mocked her, degraded her, then murdered her before the eyes of his most loyal. It was a demonstration of how dissent would be met, not just with death, but humiliation and horror. The room was quiet not out of solemnity, but because every Death Eater present knew this was their standard. If they were to serve the Dark Lord, they must perform cruelty with theatrical grandeur. "She deserved it," Bellatrix whispered, but her eyes were wide, perhaps with admiration, or perhaps even fear. No one, not even his own, was safe from the expectations of terror. Even Snape, who walked the line between spy and Death Eater, understood the power of fear. Though his heart ultimately betrayed Voldemort's mission, during his years as a double agent, he mastered the persona demanded by the Dark Lord. Students feared him more than they feared detention. His silences were heavy, his sarcasm cutting, his punishments brutal in their restraint. "There will be no foolish wand-waving," he said during his first lesson at Hogwarts, establishing authority through intimidation rather than warmth. In Voldemort's world, fear was currency, and Snape became a wealthy man. Though his motives differed, he still adhered to the aesthetic the Dark Lord required. One of the most horrifying aspects of Voldemort's reign was his manipulation of symbols. The Dark Mark, once a simple tattoo, became an instrument of psychological warfare. Death Eaters didn't just cast it after killings. Sometimes it was cast above a home with no bodies inside. Sometimes it was burned into the sky over empty fields. The ambiguity made it worse. Was someone dead? Had someone talked? Was someone next? This manipulation of uncertainty was brilliant. "You-know-who's got ways of knowing if you say his name," whispered Molly Weasley. And the fact that it wasn't true didn't matter. People believed it. The fear became self-sustaining. It no longer needed fuel. Dolohov, silent and brutal, was another craftsman of fear. He rarely spoke during battles. He didn't gloat like Bellatrix or debate like Lucius. He simply attacked with lethal efficiency. His duel in the Department of Mysteries left Hermione grievously wounded with a non-verbal curse, so dangerous that even naming it in public might be considered taboo. He was not famous for words or politics. He was a living reminder that Death Eaters weren't all the same. Some spoke, some laughed. Dolohov simply watched and struck. For survivors, that kind of enemy was the most frightening, unreadable, silent, deadly. Number 16. Never question Voldemort's immortality. When Lord Voldemort fell on that October night in Godric's Hollow, his body destroyed by a rebounded curse, and his name reduced to a fearful whisper, the wizarding world erupted in celebration. But within the shadows behind the gilded doors of ancient manors and the hidden halls of forsaken castles, a different kind of silence settled, a silence of doubt. For the Death Eaters, this was the hour that tested more than their magic. It tested their belief in immortality, their faith in the unthinkable, that the Dark Lord could never truly die. And yet some failed that test. Some, like Lucius Malfoy, Narcissa Black, and others of noble blood, fell prey to the unspoken crime of doubt. And for this, they would one day bleed. Voldemort never demanded loyalty for the sake of ceremony. His rule was built upon fear and power, but also upon a deeper demand, a belief system. At its center was a rule more sacred than any spell or contract. One does not doubt the immortality of the Dark Lord. To do so was to invite death, not just for oneself, but for one's bloodline. Voldemort was more than a man to his followers. He was inevitability, a being who existed beyond time and form. To believe in him was not just a matter of loyalty, it was survival. As Bellatrix Lestrange once screamed, in a voice thick with ecstasy and devotion, "The Dark Lord lives in us, through us, always." Yet, after his fall, cracks appeared. When Voldemort vanished, so too did the conviction of many who had once killed in his name. Lucius Malfoy, once a proud bearer of the Dark Mark, quickly shifted into a life of luxury and political manipulation, attending ministry galas and funding school governors. He claimed he had been under the imperious curse, a weak lie the ministry accepted only because it suited their need to believe the terror was over. But Voldemort never forgot. The loyalty of Malfoy had been conditional, like a flame easily extinguished when the wind of adversity blew. This was the kind of weakness the Dark Lord abhorred. The truest of his servants never doubted. Bellatrix, Rodolphus, and Rabastan Lestrange were among those who went to Azkaban not with shame, but with pride. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Sirius Black described them coldly. They were fanatical. They went to Azkaban for him. They never stopped believing he'd come back. And that belief, irrational, maddening, blind, is what Voldemort valued most. Not cleverness, not even strength, but faith. That unshakable certainty that he was more than flesh and blood, that he was destiny itself. This unwavering belief was a form of magic far darker than any curse. It bound the Death Eaters together in a kind of twisted religion, where Voldemort was both god and prophet. He demanded offerings, not of gold, but of silence, sacrifice, and blood. Doubt was the only heresy, and those who allowed themselves to think the impossible, that he was truly gone, sealed their fates. When Voldemort rose again in the graveyard of Little Hangleton, reborn in bone and blood, the reckoning began. The faithful were exalted, the hesitant were punished. Lucius Malfoy, though accepted back into the fold, was never again trusted. His pride became his chain. Wormtail, or Peter Pettigrew, is another embodiment of this terrible rule. Though his loyalty was born not of faith but fear, he nonetheless clung to the belief that Voldemort would return. He wandered in rat form for years, listening, watching, hiding in the shadows of shame. Yet even he understood the sacred nature of Voldemort's supposed immortality. He sought him out not for love, but for the safety of being close to the inevitable. In the Goblet of Fire, when Voldemort speaks of Wormtail's service, he says, "You return to me not out of loyalty but out of fear, and yet you have returned." In Voldemort's eyes, that was enough, for a time. The crime of doubt went beyond mere words or decisions. It bled into the heart, even the quiet moments of hesitation, wondering if the Dark Lord would ever walk again, if perhaps he had been defeated after all. These were the betrayals that could not be erased. Voldemort had no need for traitors in robes. He had only use for those who would whisper his name, even in their sleep, who would carve his symbol into their skin, not just in ink, but in devotion. As he told his followers upon his return, "You have had 13 years in which to lie to me, to convince yourselves that I was gone. You have had your rewards. Now you shall pay for your treachery." This punishment was never abstract. It took form. Voldemort's rage against those who wavered manifested in suffering, in the ruin of families. Lucius Malfoy's fall from grace was swift. His actions in the Department of Mysteries led to imprisonment, and though later released, he was stripped of his power, his influence, his place at the Dark Lord's side. Narcissa lived in fear, and Draco became a pawn, proof that the sin of doubt passes from parent to child. By the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, Lucius was not a Death Eater. He was a broken man, a relic of a once glorious cruelty, now only pleading for the safety of his son. The rule of belief did not die with Voldemort's final fall. It continued in whispers among those who refused to let go of the myth. In the decades following the Second Wizarding War, some still clung to the idea that the Dark Lord had not truly been destroyed, that he had left behind shards of his will, hidden in the corners of dark magic. This idea that Voldemort was beyond death, beyond consequence, was not easily extinguished. It lived on in cursed objects, in forbidden texts, and in the scars burned into the skin of those who had once called him Master. Number 17. Treat Muggles as resources, not people. The ideology of Lord Voldemort did not form in a vacuum. It was crafted, sharpened, and burned into the minds of his followers like the dark mark on their skin. To serve the Dark Lord was not just to obey, it was to think like him, to reshape morality into weaponry, and to suppress all forms of human empathy when it came to Muggles. In his world, Muggles were never equals. They were cattle at best, collateral damage at worst, and always, always disposable. Voldemort's rise brought with it not just a political terror, but a philosophical rot, a redefinition of human value based entirely on magical ability. A true Death Eater didn't simply hate Muggles, he saw them as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. And those who failed to embrace this doctrine were treated as traitors to the cause. One of the earliest and most haunting examples of this philosophy in action was the use of Charity Burbage. She was not just a Muggle studies professor, she was a believer, someone who dared to say that Muggles and wizards were equal. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, we witness her bound and suspended above the table at Malfoy Manor, pleading for mercy. Voldemort mocks her belief in equality and kills her without hesitation, feeding her corpse to Nagini. Her death wasn't just a murder, it was a demonstration, a message to every Death Eater seated at that table. This is what happens to those who view Muggles as human beings. "She would have us mate with them," Voldemort sneered. Her murder was both symbolic and instructive, a grotesque reinforcement of the rule that no follower of the Dark Lord could afford to break. The Ministry of Magic, under Voldemort's control, became a factory of ideological enforcement. Through the Muggle-born Registration Commission chaired by Dolores Umbridge, Muggle-born witches and wizards were interrogated, humiliated, and accused of stealing magic. Their family histories were dissected not for truth, but for political theatre. Even those who had never met a Death Eater were forced into the machinery of Voldemort's thinking. Muggle-borns, stripped of rights and dignity, were made to confess that they had no magical lineage, a manufactured crime in the eyes of a regime that needed scapegoats. The commission wasn't about justice, it was about instilling a culture of disdain. It was about conditioning wizards to see the non-magicals, and even magical people of non-pure blood, as unworthy of fair treatment. Bellatrix Lestrange embodied the doctrine of dehumanization more vividly than almost any other Death Eater. Her sadism wasn't random, it was ideologically charged. Torturing Hermione Granger at Malfoy Manor, she didn't just try to extract information, she tried to destroy Hermione's spirit. She carved the word mudblood into Hermione's skin as if branding livestock. Hermione, a brilliant and courageous witch, was seen by Bellatrix not as a threat, but as a trespasser. The very existence of such talent in a Muggle-born was offensive. It mocked the supremacist structure Voldemort had built. And so her punishment had to be not just violent, but symbolic, a warning that the impure would suffer no matter their skill or bravery. The rule, to see Muggles as resources, was often extended to entire families. Take the case of the Riddle household. Voldemort murdered his Muggle father and grandparents in Little Hangleton, not because they posed a threat, but because they were reminders of his Muggle ancestry, a stain he refused to acknowledge. He did not simply kill them. He used their deaths to create one of his Horcruxes, transforming a murder into a magical tool. In Voldemort's world, even death could be utilitarian. The Muggles he destroyed became stepping stones to immortality. And in doing so, he demonstrated the ultimate perversion, that a Muggle life could be reduced to magical currency. Wormtail, though cowardly and weak, understood this principle well. In the Goblet of Fire, he murders Bertha Jorkins, a ministry employee, not out of hatred, but because she had information. Once extracted through torture, she was discarded. She was a liability, Voldemort said coldly. Her memory, her story, her humanity, none of it mattered, only her usefulness did. And once that utility was gone, so was her life. Voldemort's followers learned from this. Usefulness was the only currency Muggles and half-bloods could offer. Compassion was a sin, mercy was betrayal. Lucius Malfoy, elegant and calculating, served as a model of how aristocratic cruelty could be married with Voldemort's ideology. His actions weren't overtly violent, but deeply rooted in contempt. His manipulation of Cornelius Fudge, his disdain for Arthur Weasley, his subtle threats, all stemmed from the belief that bloodline dictated value. He treated Muggles with politeness only when it benefited him, such as when manipulating the Ministry's decisions. But behind closed doors, he too viewed them as pawns. Even the way he raised Draco was telling. He passed down the creed of exploitation, teaching his son that power came from domination, not cooperation. That Muggles were there to be used, and if necessary, destroyed. Fenrir Greyback, a Death Eater by action if not by mark, provided perhaps the most grotesque manifestation of Voldemort's ideology. He specifically targeted children, infecting them with lycanthropy, not for strategic purposes but for terror. He was allowed to operate with impunity because Voldemort understood the psychological impact. A werewolf in a Muggle community was not just a tragedy, it was a lesson in helplessness. Greyback's existence within the ranks was proof that Voldemort saw Muggles not only as non-human, but as perfect subjects for monstrous experimentation. No true Death Eater protested Greyback's methods. To do so would have been to express empathy, and that was forbidden. Number 18. Suppress individuality. In the dark corridors of power built by Lord Voldemort, no light of individuality was allowed to flicker. The Death Eaters, his most loyal and terrifying followers, were not meant to shine, they were meant to serve. Their identities dissolved into the collective shadow of the Dark Lord's ambition, and their only purpose was to be instruments of his will. No matter how powerful, cunning, or charismatic they might have been on their own, their strength was measured solely by their ability to disappear beneath the weight of his ideology. In Voldemort's world, the greatest virtue was obedience, and the greatest sin was self-expression. There were many among the Death Eaters who had ambition, skill, even brilliance, but their rise or fall depended on how fully they erased themselves. To be noticed for one's personality was a liability. Even Bellatrix Lestrange, the most flamboyant of Voldemort's servants, understood this rule better than most. Though she laughed, screamed, and spilled blood with operatic fervour, she never allowed her performances to compete with the majesty of the Dark Lord. Her madness was theatrical, but always bent in reverence toward him. She might cry out with joy when killing, but it was joy in his name. When she grovelled, it was sincere and absolute. "The Dark Lord has in the past entrusted me with his most precious," she whispered, in the Half-Blood Prince, always reminding others of her proximity to him, never of her own greatness. Others were not so wise. Lucius Malfoy, for instance, forgot this unwritten law. He allowed his wealth, name, and arrogance to stand too visibly beside the Dark Lord's plans. He let himself be seen as an individual, polished, self-important, with ambitions of his own, and for this he was broken. His fall from grace began not with a mistake in battle, but with the sin of self-importance. By the time we meet him again in the Deathly Hallows, he is no longer the proud lord of Malfoy Manor, but a trembling shadow who has learned too late that the Dark Lord does not forgive ego. His punishment was not death. It was humiliation, the ultimate erasure of the self he once clung to. In Voldemort's army there was no room for I. The pronoun itself, though never banned aloud, was spiritually forbidden. When Voldemort spoke, it was always with divine authority. When his followers responded, it was always with collective devotion. This principle was not limited to language, but extended to all forms of self-expression. The Death Eaters wore identical robes and masks for a reason. Their anonymity was both symbolic and practical. Individuality was dangerous because it bred self-will, and self-will was incompatible with absolute loyalty. Consider Severus Snape, whose dual life was built on subtle resistance to this code. Though he played the part of Death Eater well, Voldemort never trusted him entirely. Snape's inner world remained a secret space, full of grief, memory, and love, things that had no place in the Dark Lord's vision. Though Snape gave Voldemort valuable information and served with apparent obedience, he never offered his soul. That was his triumph, and also the reason he was always watched. Voldemort did not need thinking men, he needed shadows. Snape survived not by erasing his mind, but by cloaking it so thoroughly that even the Dark Lord could not penetrate it. Barty Crouch Jr., by contrast, was the ideal follower. His life, identity, and mind were completely surrendered. He took the Polyjuice potion for months, becoming Mad-Eye Moody not just in form but in soul. He disappeared into the role so fully that he stopped being Barty. For a time, there was no inner self left, only the mission. He exemplified what Voldemort required, total self-erasure in service of the goal. When his real identity was revealed, he was no longer a person, but a vessel that had outlived its purpose. Voldemort's army did not mourn the loss. Even among the youngest initiates, the pattern repeated. Draco Malfoy, though born into a Death Eater family and raised with pure blood supremacy, found himself suffocating under the pressure of self-annihilation. When asked to kill Dumbledore, he hesitated, not because he lacked hatred, but because his soul resisted the loss of its own shape. His struggle was not just with morality, but with identity. He was being forced to become a tool, and the resistance he showed was, in Voldemort's eyes, weakness. That is why Draco was punished with isolation and scrutiny. The Dark Lord does not tolerate the conflict between duty and conscience. Individuality in dress, too, was suspect. There is a reason why Bellatrix, despite her wild hair and mad laughter, never adorned herself with jewelry, personal sigils, or any sign of feminine vanity. Her appearance was not a reflection of herself, but of the chaos she wielded on Voldemort's behalf. She did not want to be beautiful or memorable. She wanted to be feared as his sword. The moment a Death Eater stood out for being too fashionable, too eloquent, or too clever, they marked themselves for suspicion. Voldemort desired a uniform army, not a court of personalities. Cult-like worship of the Dark Lord meant that even personal motivations had to be subsumed. One could desire power, yes, but only as a servant of his cause. To seek power for oneself was heresy. Regulus Black is a tragic example. At first, he joined Voldemort's ranks with typical youthful ambition, likely imagining glory and status. But when he realized the cost, the complete surrender of self, including moral autonomy, he chose death. His secret act of rebellion in stealing the Horcrux was not just an act of defiance, but of reclaiming his identity. In that moment, he ceased to be a Death Eater and became a human again. The rule was enforced not only by Voldemort's punishments, but by peer pressure within the ranks. Anyone who questioned orders, hesitated in violence, or spoke too passionately was often silenced, either by other Death Eaters or by Voldemort's wrath. A system of fear ensured conformity. Loyalty was not enough. One had to demonstrate it with rituals, tortures, and murders. A lack of enthusiasm was dangerous. A flash of conscience could cost a life. Even familial bonds were secondary. When Narcissa lied to Voldemort to protect Draco, she broke the rule, but survived only because Voldemort was too arrogant to notice her deceit. Had he known, she would have died. It's important to understand that the suppression of identity was not a side effect. It was the foundation. Voldemort did not desire loyalty in the traditional sense. He demanded reverence. He placed himself above love, above reason, even above death. His followers were extensions of his will, not partners in a cause. Those who attempted to combine their own desires with his mission, like Lucius or even Peter Pettigrew, always failed. Pettigrew, though obedient, retained a pathetic sense of self. He wanted recognition, appreciation, perhaps even friendship, but Voldemort scorned him for it. "Wormtail is here to assist me," Voldemort said coldly in the Goblet of Fire, refusing even to look at him. For Voldemort, emotions like gratitude were signs of weakness. There was a brutal logic to this system. An army built on fear and uniformity was less likely to rebel. No Death Eater could rise to challenge the Dark Lord because none were allowed to believe in their own strength. Every time a follower showed signs of independence, they were cut down or humiliated. When Voldemort demanded the Elder Wand, he did not ask. He took it from the dead. When he needed a body to return, he used Pettigrew's flesh. When he needed a scapegoat, he gave Lucius the diary. To serve Voldemort was to become a part of him. Literally and metaphorically, nothing you owned was truly yours. Even death was not personal. The way the Death Eaters died reveals the extent of their dehumanization. Bellatrix was struck down not as a woman, but as a monster in battle. Crouch was kissed by a Dementor, his soul devoured without fanfare. Snape, though innocent in the end, was killed like a traitor, discarded as a tool. None were buried with honors, none were eulogized. They were not people, they were masks. And when the masks fell, there was nothing beneath. This is the core of Voldemort's regime, the elimination of identity in favor of control. The price of power in his world was the death of the self. Only the Dark Lord could shine. All others were to be silent stars in the cold sky of his ambition. To follow Voldemort was to follow a rule darker than any curse. Do not be seen, do not be known, do not exist beyond your usefulness. And for those who failed to vanish, the punishment was swift, final, and terrifyingly impersonal. Number 19, preserve order within the ranks. In the cold heart of the Second Wizarding War, where loyalty was measured in blood and silence, there existed a rule so sacred among Death Eaters that it was never spoken aloud, only understood: preserve the purity of the cause. The followers of Lord Voldemort were not merely warriors or spellcasters. They were vessels of his will, guardians of his ideals, and enforcers of an order where weakness was the only true betrayal. To remain within the Dark Lord's circle was not just to kill when asked. It was to watch, to report, and to strike at the first sign of decay among their own. The death of a traitor was not a loss. It was a cleansing. Among them, the pressure to conform was relentless. It wasn't just about committing violence, but about believing in it, breathing it, and encouraging it in others. To falter was to invite scrutiny. Bellatrix Lestrange, the most fanatical of Voldemort's followers, once turned on her own family to enforce this rule. Her sister, Andromeda, who married a Muggle-born and turned her back on pure-blood supremacy, was instantly erased from the family tree. Bellatrix didn't mourn her. She acted as if Andromeda had never existed. That erasure was not personal, it was policy. This enforcement of ideological purity was not limited to the familial sphere. Even within the tight inner circles of the Death Eaters, suspicion was a tool as sharp as a blade. During the events of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, it was no coincidence that Voldemort entrusted Draco Malfoy with the impossible task of assassinating Dumbledore. It wasn't a gift, it was a test. Lucius Malfoy had failed him at the Department of Mysteries, and Voldemort's trust in the Malfoy family wavered. Draco's assignment was a cruel gamble to force loyalty or expose treachery. The rule to preserve purity was never clearer than in the fates of those who hesitated. Regulus Arcturus Black was once a loyal Death Eater. But when he discovered the true nature of Voldemort's Horcruxes and the inhumanity they represented, he turned against the Dark Lord in silence. He stole the locket from its hiding place, replacing it with a decoy and a note. He signed it simply R.A.B. That act of defiance marked him for death. His own creature, the house elf, lived with the trauma of watching him drown. No one spoke of Regulus afterward. His name was scrubbed from their history. The purity had been defended by erasing the impure. There was no such thing as private dissent. To question the Dark Lord, even in thought, was to invite annihilation. The Carrows, Amicus, and Alecto took this rule to Hogwarts when they were appointed to teach. They did not simply instruct, they monitored. Amicus expected students to torture each other as punishment. Alecto watched their eyes and listened to their words. Students who refused to perform the Cruciatus Curse were punished or disappeared. This wasn't discipline, it was indoctrination. Even children were taught that obedience was survival and silence was a weapon. The greatest irony was that Voldemort himself engineered the system to encourage betrayal among his followers, just as he feared it most. Snape thrived in this environment because he understood that to survive, he had to play both sides with the precision of a wand tip. To the Death Eaters, he was ruthless, efficient, and loyal. Yet Dumbledore once remarked, he's playing a dangerous game. The danger came from the very principle Voldemort instilled. If a Death Eater suspected Snape of even a shadow of hesitation, he would be reported, and Voldemort would execute him without hesitation. It was this constant fear of exposure that shaped Snape's every breath. There was a sick genius to the design. By making every Death Eater responsible for the purity of the whole, Voldemort created a self-policing hierarchy. They spied on one another, not because they distrusted each other, but because they feared being the last to report a traitor. If you noticed a comrade faltering and failed to act, you became the next suspect. This paranoia kept them obedient. It was a logic as brutal as it was effective. Even Wormtail, the cowardly Peter Pettigrew, understood this rule. He clung to Voldemort not out of ideology, but fear. And when he began to show signs of mercy, hesitating when tasked with killing Harry in the cellar of Malfoy Manor, his silver hand, enchanted by Voldemort himself, turned on him. "You showed mercy," the hand seemed to whisper as it crushed his throat. Voldemort had made it so that even a gesture of weakness was fatal. The hand was not just a reward, it was a leash, programmed to choke him if he ever acted against the doctrine of purity. The concept of purity extended beyond loyalty. It also applied to blood. Those who were not of pure wizarding lineage were seen as pollutants in Voldemort's perfect world. The Death Eaters didn't just torture Muggleborns, they performed ideological cleansing. Charity Burbage, the Muggle Studies professor at Hogwarts, was murdered for the crime of teaching tolerance. Her lifeless body hung above the dinner table as Voldemort fed Nagini in front of his gathered followers. It was a message. Empathy is treason. But what of those who didn't act fast enough? Igor Karkaroff was a prime example. Once a Death Eater, he turned informant during the First War, naming names to save himself from Azkaban. For a while, he was forgotten, but the Death Eaters remembered. When Voldemort returned, Karkaroff fled. They hunted him like an animal. When his body was found in a shack, the dark mark burned over it as a warning. Hesitation, even from decades ago, was not forgiven. There was no statute of limitations on betrayal. Even among Voldemort's closest confidants, the rule held dominion. When Barty Crouch Jr. was discovered to be impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, his use of Polyjuice Potion and the lengths to which he went to return Voldemort to power earned him the Dark Lord's respect. But had he failed, had he been caught before the Triwizard Tournament, he would have been discarded without a thought. Voldemort respected only results. Passion without utility was useless. Loyalty without success was failure. No Death Eater could afford to fail twice. What Voldemort created was not a family nor even a military. It was a machine that fed on suspicion and rewarded cruelty. When Voldemort resurrected himself, he didn't thank those who had waited. He punished those who hadn't searched hard enough. "Many of our oldest family trees become a little diseased over time," he sneered. "You must prune yours, must you not, Lucius?" Even the most loyal servants were only as safe as their last sacrifice. One misstep, and they were fertilizer for the Dark Lord's garden. In this ruthless world, the concept of trust ceased to exist. Rodolphus Lestrange may have fought beside his wife, but if she had faltered, if she had hesitated, he would have turned on her to survive. That was the unspoken law. Bellatrix, for all her fervour, would not have hesitated either. It wasn't love that kept them united. It was survival in a regime that devoured doubt. This is why so few Death Eaters remained after the war. Their system, built on cannibalizing the unsure, could not sustain peace. In war they thrived because fear was currency. In peace, the truth emerged. There was nothing binding them except mutual terror. They had no ideology beyond Voldemort's whims. And when he fell, the machine turned on itself, with betrayals surfacing in courtroom testimonies and desperate pleas. The rule, preserve the purity of the cause, was never about morality. It was about obedience and elimination. It was what drove them to murder children, silence dissent, and consume their own. It created a world in which evil did not need to hide, it simply needed to conform. In Voldemort's army, loyalty was proven not through courage, but through cruelty. And the moment a follower blinked, someone was always watching. Number 20. Trust no one except the Dark Lord. The dark world of Lord Voldemort thrived not on loyalty or friendship, but on fear and control. Within his inner circle, the Death Eaters, there was no place for trust. That was not a flaw of the system, it was the very design. Voldemort never intended to foster unity among his followers. He cultivated division, ensuring that no two Death Eaters ever stood shoulder to shoulder for long. Rivalry was encouraged, suspicion was weaponized, and any sign of closeness was seen as weakness. The only loyalty that mattered was the one directed solely at him. He was the nucleus around which the rest orbited, trembling and competing for favor. All others, even fellow servants of darkness, were dispensable. Bellatrix Lestrange stood as a prime example of this principle. Fanatically loyal to the Dark Lord, she viewed the rest of the Death Eaters as inferior. Her obsession with Voldemort blinded her to any potential alliance with others. Even her own husband, Rodolphus, was a background figure compared to her reverence for Voldemort. This dynamic wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. Voldemort allowed, even encouraged, Bellatrix's delusions of being closest to him. It kept her ruthless, kept her useful. But her example also served as a warning. No matter how devoted, none were safe. Voldemort could discard anyone. He used Bellatrix's loyalty, never returned it, and ensured she would die thinking she was serving something divine. In the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, this ideology became vividly clear. Lucius Malfoy, a prominent Death Eater, was tasked with retrieving the prophecy, but he wasn't sent alone. Voldemort sent a group of Death Eaters who, despite working together, were under no illusion of comradeship. Dot, Crabbe, Avery, McNair, and Dolohov were all part of the mission, and each knew that failure would not be blamed collectively. It would fall on individuals. When Lucius hesitated, when his leadership faltered, the others didn't shield him. They fought independently, chaotically, and in the end were caught and imprisoned. None of the others mourned him. None came to his aid. That was the price of being a Death Eater, usefulness over loyalty, and individual failure met with isolation. Even Severus Snape, perhaps the most complex figure in the entire saga, embodied this ruthless logic. To Voldemort, Snape was an asset. He was not trusted. Voldemort did not believe in trust. He was valuable because of what he could do. As Dumbledore's confidant and a teacher at Hogwarts, Snape provided intelligence and access. But when Voldemort questioned his true allegiance, he didn't hesitate to test him. In The Half-Blood Prince, Voldemort assigned Draco Malfoy the task of killing Dumbledore, not because he expected success, but because he wanted to punish Lucius, test Narcissa, and observe Snape. Voldemort turned a teenager into bait and saw whether the adult Death Eaters would sacrifice themselves for him. None did. Snape took on the unbreakable vow not out of camaraderie, but to preserve his own position, to stay useful. The vow wasn't a promise of compassion, it was survival. Voldemort designed his rule around this principle. You must not trust anyone but me. This was more than advice, it was doctrine. Those who ignored it suffered. Barty Crouch Jr., one of the most loyal Death Eaters, lived and breathed Voldemort's cause. He sacrificed everything, even his identity, to place Harry's name into the Goblet of Fire. He lived under the guise of Mad-Eye Moody for nearly a year, risking discovery every day. But after fulfilling his mission, after capturing Harry and delivering him to the graveyard, he was discarded. Voldemort did not save him. He did not reward him. He silenced him. Kill the spare. Applied not only to Cedric Diggory, it foreshadowed how Voldemort saw even his most loyal as temporary tools. The absence of genuine friendship among Death Eaters wasn't accidental. It was systematically enforced. A telling moment appears in the Deathly Hallows when Yaxley and Snape arrive together at Malfoy Manor. Voldemort doesn't praise their teamwork. Instead, he humiliates them in front of others, asserting dominance, forcing each of them to remember that only he deserves reverence. He uses Lucius' home, disrespects his family, and places Nagini in a position of fear and control. There is no fellowship at the table, only subordination. Even when they share laughter or cruelty, it is hollow, transactional, and competitive. Narcissa Malfoy, in a moment of quiet rebellion, reveals the deepest flaw in Voldemort's philosophy. During the Battle of Hogwarts, when she lies to him about Harry being dead, she doesn't do it for strategy or power. She does it for her son. She knows that the cause is hollow, that Voldemort would never save Draco. Her whisper, "Is Draco alive?" shows that even in this world of darkness, human ties can survive. But they survive in secrecy. She couldn't speak of it, couldn't act openly, or she would be destroyed. Voldemort's doctrine left no room for love. Narcissa broke that rule, but only by lying. One of the most chilling consequences of Voldemort's philosophy was how it corrupted even those on the margins. Peter Pettigrew, Wormtail, betrayed his closest friends for safety. He entered Voldemort's service not out of belief but fear. Voldemort rewarded this treachery not with trust, but with mockery. He gave Pettigrew a silver hand, enchanted to obey his will. When Pettigrew hesitated later, when his loyalty wavered for a second in the cellar of Malfoy Manor, that hand turned against him. Voldemort's magic killed him. It was a brutal reinforcement of the rule, trust no one, not even yourself. One moment of mercy meant death. The ideology of distrust extended to Voldemort's strategy as a whole. His Horcruxes were not hidden with allies. He placed one in the cave, protected by curses, another in the vault of Bellatrix, one inside Hogwarts itself, and one with a snake. He didn't give any of them to a follower directly. That would mean vulnerability. That would mean sharing power. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore notes he would not have wanted to put it into anyone else's hands. Even his soul, the most sacred part of himself, was never entrusted to a Death Eater. Dolohov and Rookwood, who were active in the First Wizarding War, and then again in the Second, serve as further proof. These men weren't comrades, they were competitors. In the Order of the Phoenix, Dolohov curses Hermione during the battle at the Ministry, and when captured later, shows no loyalty to his captured allies. Rookwood, once a Ministry insider, cared only for information. He gave Voldemort access to the Department of Mysteries, but not out of trust in exchange for protection. None of them shared dreams or friendship. Their unity came from fear, and it dissolved as easily as fog when the Dark Lord vanished. Regulus Black, the younger brother of Sirius, left the Death Eaters when he realized what Voldemort truly was. When Voldemort used Kreacher, the Black family's elf, and left him to die in the cave after testing the Horcrux protections, Regulus saw the truth. Voldemort didn't value followers, he didn't reward loyalty, he used and discarded. Regulus sacrificed his life to retrieve the locket, not for redemption, but because he realized he was never a part of something meaningful. That epiphany killed him, but it proved the rule once more. Even the pure-blood noble houses were expendable. The inner rot of Voldemort's circle became most visible during the Battle of Hogwarts. As the tide turned, Death Eaters fled. The Carrows, once brutal enforcers at Hogwarts, disappeared. Others switched sides or vanished in the chaos. No one died defending Voldemort. No one made a stand. They had served out of fear, and when fear failed, so did their loyalty. The unity of the Dark Lord dissolved when his invincibility cracked. Only Bellatrix stayed, and she too died, her death a tragic echo of her misguided faith in a master who never cared. In the end, Voldemort stood alone. He had taught his followers never to trust, and they obeyed, but in doing so, he created a kingdom of shadows where no one truly belonged. His army was not a brotherhood, but a herd of wolves forced into submission. When he fell, they scattered, because none of them believed in anything greater than their own survival. That was his legacy, not fearlessness, not revolution, but the cold, empty consequence of building power on distrust. "Only I can live forever," Voldemort once said. But he was wrong. He could not live forever because he never understood what makes people stand and fight even when hope is gone. He ruled through terror, demanded obedience, and taught his Death Eaters to see each other as threats. And so, in the moment he needed them most, they were gone. Not because they had turned to good, but because they had learned from him. Trust no one, not even him. Number 21. Embrace blood and pain. In the dark, winding corridors of Malfoy Manor, there were no second chances. Among the Death Eaters, hesitation was betrayal. The path to serving Voldemort demanded the annihilation of fear, especially fear of blood and pain. Those who flinched at a scream, those who blinked at the sight of torn flesh, did not last long. For Voldemort, cruelty was not merely a weapon. It was the crucible that separated the truly loyal from the weak. He forged his followers through agony, ensuring that pain became not a burden, but a routine, as ordinary as drawing one's wand. Bellatrix Lestrange embodied this rule with every fibre of her deranged soul. She didn't merely cast the Cruciatus Curse. She performed it like a symphony. Her eyes lit up at the convulsions of her victims. Her lips curled in delight at their screams. "You need to mean it," she had once said of the Cruciatus Curse, and she did. She meant it with all her heart, pouring ecstasy into suffering. When she tortured the Longbottoms into insanity, it wasn't just a mission, it was art. She set the standard. If you could not torture without mercy, you could not wear the Dark Mark. The Dark Lord expected every one of his followers to transcend moral limits. Blood on your hands was not a stain, it was a badge. When Severus Snape killed Albus Dumbledore, there were no tears, no whispers of regret. To earn Voldemort's trust, Snape had to prove he could silence the greatest wizard alive, even when the world believed Dumbledore to be the last hope against darkness. The order was clear, the price was immense, but Snape did not falter. Not in front of Draco, not in front of Death Eaters, not even before Dumbledore's pleading eyes. In Voldemort's world, loyalty was measured in sacrifice, and nothing was more sacred than obedience under fire. There was no tolerance for weakness, and Voldemort made examples of those who disappointed him. The Knight Avery begged for forgiveness, writhing on the floor beneath the Dark Lord's wand. The room watched in silence. No one moved to help him. Mercy was treason. Voldemort's voice was calm as he pronounced Avery's punishment, and the pain that followed was precise. It wasn't about punishment. It was about conditioning. The others understood. Pain was not just a consequence. It was the lesson. For Voldemort, cruelty had purpose. He did not revel in mindless slaughter. He crafted horror to maintain control. When he assigned Draco Malfoy to kill Dumbledore, he knew the boy wasn't ready. But readiness wasn't the point. He wanted to see if the boy would drown or evolve. In war, softness was a disease. Voldemort infected his ranks with brutality, daring them to survive the fever or die trying. It was never about the murder. It was about the transformation. The Death Eaters who thrived were those who accepted this transformation. Fenrir Greyback was not even a true Death Eater, but his savagery granted him access to Voldemort's inner circle. He did not use wands. He used teeth. He used claws. He mutilated children not for strategy, but to instill terror. Voldemort tolerated, even encouraged, this sadism. Why? Because fear was currency. Because loyalty bought through dread was more stable than loyalty earned by ideology. Greyback wasn't civil, but he was useful. Even among the pure-blood elite, Voldemort demanded rituals of cruelty. When Lucius Malfoy failed to retrieve the prophecy, he was humiliated. Stripped of favor, his home turned into headquarters, his wand eventually confiscated. Voldemort didn't kill him. That would have been too merciful. Instead, he made him a prisoner in his own mansion, surrounded by corpses and serpents, while his son was sent on a suicide mission. This was how Voldemort punished weakness, not through death, but through degradation, through pain that lasted. The turning point in Voldemort's rise was not a spell, but an execution. In the Ministry's atrium, during the final duel with Dumbledore, he did not hesitate to possess Harry, hoping to force Dumbledore to kill the boy. He believed in pushing the limits of loyalty. Even in his own body, Voldemort tested boundaries. He was willing to endure anything, even near death, to achieve dominance. If his followers weren't ready to match that devotion, they were dispensable. His lessons in pain were not restricted to enemies. He forced followers to torture their own. He demanded blood from friends, family, children. Alecto Carrow did not hesitate to curse students at Hogwarts. Amicus spat on their corpses. Their task was not education, it was terror. Voldemort wanted the next generation bathed in cruelty, a world of trembling children grown into loyal monsters. There could be no rebellion in a world where empathy had been surgically removed. The darkest ritual came in the graveyard, where Voldemort returned. He summoned Wormtail, a man whose loyalty was born not of belief but of cowardice, and still Voldemort demanded flesh. Flesh of the servant, willingly given. It was not enough to obey. Wormtail had to bleed for his master, to slice his own hand, to endure agony in exchange for favor. This was Voldemort's gospel, suffering as devotion, pain as prayer. Even among his Horcruxes, symbols of immortality, there was violence. He did not simply hide pieces of soul, he sealed them with death, the murder of Bertha Jorkins, the death of a Muggle tramp, the corpse of Hepzibah Smith. Every Horcrux bore a price in blood. Voldemort tied his immortality to acts of cruelty so profound that his soul fractured, each piece stored in a cursed object, stained with agony. To follow him meant to admire this, not fear it. In the final battle, the same rule applied. When Voldemort ordered the ceasefire to offer Harry's body, he wasn't showing mercy. He wanted despair, to see the faces of the resistance break, to watch the light leave their eyes. His manipulation of pain was psychological. Even then, when he believed himself triumphant, he weaponized grief. Not as a side effect, as strategy. That moment, Harry's limp form in Hagrid's arms, was Voldemort's victory lap in cruelty. Some Death Eaters faltered. Narcissa Malfoy, when asked to confirm Harry's death, chose her son over her master, but she lied not from rebellion. She lied from maternal instinct. And even that was an act of quiet defiance that Voldemort never suspected, because in his world affection was unthinkable. He had purged love from his doctrine. He could not imagine betrayal born of emotion. His one weakness was that he assumed no one would ever choose tenderness over terror. But the ones who stayed, who fought beside him till the end, they did so without compassion. When Bellatrix died laughing, her death was not a tragedy, it was a fulfillment. She died as she lived, in violent ecstasy. Molly Weasley's spell did not just end a life, it ended an era of cruelty. But for a moment, Bellatrix had everything she wanted: war, power, the thrill of blood. Voldemort's legacy lived in that madness, that commitment to pain. The rule Voldemort enforced was clear: you must not fear blood. You must see flesh as canvas, bones as instruments, agony as language. Hesitation was betrayal. Kindness was weakness. Love was disease. The final test of loyalty wasn't courage, it was cruelty. Those who survived his trust were those who bathed in torment and called it duty. They pierced flesh without guilt. They obeyed, even when obedience meant murder. They looked in the mirror, saw blood on their face, and smiled. Number 22. Be ready to live in hiding. The Death Eaters were never promised comfort. While Voldemort promised power, revenge, and purpose, he never offered them peace. To serve the Dark Lord meant forfeiting all notions of stability. Any illusion of safety was temporary, fragile as parchment in fire. Rabastan Lestrange knew this better than most. A pure-blood wizard born into a family of dark magic and tradition, Rabastan chose the path of servitude early, believing it would lead to glory. But after the fall of Voldemort in 1981, Rabastan's path twisted into something darker, a life underground, on the run, sustained by fear more than ambition. For the faithful servant of the Dark Lord, survival meant readiness to vanish without warning, to live without attachments, to exist in shadows rather than sunlight. It was never about comfort. It was about loyalty. Those who pledged themselves to Voldemort accepted that their lives were no longer their own. Bellatrix Lestrange, Rabastan's sister-in-law, and the most fanatical of all Death Eaters, spent nearly 15 years in Azkaban, her mind half broken, but her devotion untouched. And when Rabastan and his brother Rodolphus were finally caught, it wasn't weakness that betrayed them, but circumstance. They had hidden well, changing locations, names, and even magical signatures, but no matter how carefully they moved, they were hunted, because once a Death Eater, always a fugitive. Even after Azkaban, even after the fall of their master, society never forgave them, and Voldemort, when he returned, never forgot the ones who faltered, even in chains. The prophecy might have determined the fate of Harry Potter, but it also shaped the fate of every one of Voldemort's followers. With the Dark Lord's near destruction came chaos. Those who had built their lives around his ideology were left to fend for themselves in a world that wanted them dead or imprisoned. Some went into deep hiding, like Travers and Mulciber. Others, like Lucius Malfoy, bought their way into temporary freedom, pretending they had acted under the Imperious curse. But that safety was fragile. The Ministry watched, auras hunted, old allies turned into enemies. There was no loyalty among the hunted, only desperation. It was a hard truth Voldemort never said aloud, but one every follower eventually learned. Once you bear the dark mark, your only home is the road. Harry, without intending it, became the embodiment of everything Voldemort's servants feared. His very existence meant that Voldemort could be defeated. He was the symbol of resistance, and that made him the axis around which Death Eaters' nightmares spun. Every rumor of Harry's movements sent them into hiding. Every sighting triggered suspicion. Voldemort wanted Harry dead not just to fulfill a prophecy, but to eliminate the reason his followers kept glancing over their shoulders. Because if Harry lived, they would never rest. As Voldemort himself once said, there is nothing worse than death. But for Death Eaters, it turned out there was endless exile. No follower of Voldemort truly retired. They didn't grow old in peaceful manners with grandchildren playing on green lawns. Even those who survived the war, like Walden McNair, spent their lives dodging suspicion, wearing masks of civility, fearing knockings at the door. McNair became an executioner for the Ministry, hunting magical creatures, but everyone knew what he really was. The public might have tolerated him, but they never trusted him. There was always a scar, invisible but deep, carved by the dark mark. And once that mark was burned into your flesh, it branded more than your skin. It marked your soul. The Second War was even worse. By the time Voldemort rose again in 1995, his followers knew what was expected. They couldn't afford attachments. They couldn't keep family close. Even the Malfoys, once wealthy and influential, were reduced to trembling obedience. Narcissa, once regal, risked her life to lie to Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest, not out of loyalty to Harry, but to protect her son. The Dark Lord no longer cared for wealth or image. He cared only for survival and absolute submission. His servants had to be like shadows, cold, quiet, always moving. That lesson had already been learned by others in the past. Take the case of Alecto and Amicus Carrow. After Voldemort took over Hogwarts, they were placed as professors, not of knowledge, but of cruelty. They taught students how to use the Cruciatus Curse, how to torture their classmates. But even then they lived like hunted animals, surrounded by fear. They slept with wands clutched tightly because they knew the tide could turn at any moment. And when it did, when Harry returned and the battle began, they were not warriors, but cowards. They had built nothing, they owned nothing, they were simply tools in a system built on terror. The irony was cruel. Voldemort promised a new world order, one in which pure bloods would rule and the rest would kneel. But his followers never ruled, they served, and when they weren't serving, they were hiding. "There is no good and evil," Voldemort once said through Professor Quirrell. "There is only power and those too weak to seek it." But what he failed to mention was the price of that power. It came with chains, not around the wrists, but around the will. The true rule every Death Eater followed, often unknowingly, was this: be ready to run. Be ready to vanish. Be ready to die for something that will never protect you. Even Severus Snape, whose loyalty to Dumbledore outweighed his ties to the Dark Lord, understood this rule. He walked a tightrope every day, risking exposure and death. He had no home, no peace. The house in Spinner's End was not a sanctuary, it was a hideout, a place of shadows and silence. Snape understood that the only way to survive Voldemort was to give him what he wanted, and even then survival was not guaranteed. The moment he hesitated, he died, killed not by enemies, but by the master he served. That was the reality for all of them. Voldemort's love was lethal, and yet they still followed, because he gave them meaning. For men like Antonin Dolohov, who spent years in Azkaban, meaning was worth more than safety. Dolohov returned to the fold the moment Voldemort did, without hesitation. He didn't ask for protection. He knew he'd be hunted again. But for some, it was better to die with purpose than live in emptiness. That was Voldemort's greatest weapon, not his magic, but his ability to convince others that their suffering had value. That being a fugitive was a badge of honor. Sybil Trelawney, though never a Death Eater, serves as an eerie reflection of what could have been. Her prophecy began it all, and though she lived at Hogwarts, even she existed in a strange kind of exile. Ostracized, ridiculed, misunderstood, she knew the danger of words better than most. When she said, "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches," she doomed not only Harry, but every one of Voldemort's followers, because with that prophecy the war had a focal point, and once a war begins, it never ends cleanly. It leaves survivors, yes, but they don't live, they hide. Fenrir Greyback, the savage werewolf allied with Voldemort, became a nightmare even among Death Eaters. His loyalty was animalistic, his presence tolerated more than welcomed. But even he learned that the reward for service was not protection. When the Ministry fell, Greyback thrived, but as the war turned, he fled. Last seen wounded during the Battle of Hogwarts, he disappeared into the wilds. His fate unknown, his name feared. That was the life Voldemort offered, vanish or be caged, and even beasts were not spared. To be a true follower of Voldemort meant discarding the illusion of safety. The only true possessions were wands and instincts. No books, no photos, no letters. You left behind lovers, children, names. You became a whisper in a hallway, a flicker in a fireplace. No one truly knew you, and that was the point, because to be known was to be found, and to be found was to be punished by auras or by Voldemort himself. Either way, the end was the same. When the war finally ended and Voldemort was reduced to dust in the Great Hall, there was no triumph for his followers, only silence. Those who survived scattered like ashes in wind, some imprisoned, some executed, some simply gone. The Malfoy name was forever tarnished. The Lestranges faded into infamy. Those who had once walked proudly in masks and robes now avoided eye contact because even without Voldemort the rule remained: You live in hiding. You do not rest. You do not trust. You wait for the past to find you. And it always does. Number 23. Do not ask about the mission's purpose. There was one unspoken rule that governed the lives of Voldemort's followers more than any spell or command. Do not ask questions. For the Death Eaters, loyalty was not a feeling or a belief. It was a behavior, silent, immediate obedience. Voldemort demanded it with the same intensity that others might demand air to breathe. He did not tolerate hesitation, much less curiosity. Any hint of it could be interpreted as defiance, and defiance, no matter how small, led to punishment. The kind of punishment that left minds broken, bodies twisted, and names erased from whispers. The tasks Voldemort assigned often made no sense. Take, for instance, the mission he gave to Thorfinn Roll in the summer of 1997. Roll, a cruel and arrogant Death Eater, was instructed to attack a Muggle train station in the middle of the night with no instructions to kill or take prisoners. He was to create chaos, then vanish. It seemed pointless even to someone as brutish as Roll, but he obeyed. He didn't ask why. Had he asked, had he even hesitated, he might have joined the countless others who vanished under Voldemort's rage. Only later would it become clear that the attack was a distraction. The Dark Lord had needed the Ministry's attention diverted while he extracted a prophecy from the Department of Mysteries that had survived destruction. Roll had been nothing but noise, but useful noise. This kind of manipulation was common under Voldemort's command. No one was trusted with the full picture. Even Bellatrix Lestrange, his most fanatical supporter, received only fragments of the master plan. She followed, not because she understood, but because she believed in Voldemort's superiority beyond question. "The Dark Lord knows I speak nothing but the truth," she cried in Half-Blood Prince, and that truth, for her, meant total surrender. She didn't need reasons. She needed his approval. She wanted to be the perfect tool, and Voldemort admired her for that, or at least found her useful. Because Bellatrix never asked questions, not even when he demanded she torture her own sister's husband to death. For her, his word was the answer, even before the question had formed. To serve Voldemort was to give up control. Death Eaters were not soldiers. They were extensions of his will. Barty Crouch Jr., for example, sacrificed his entire identity just to re-enter Hogwarts in disguise. He drank Polyjuice Potion for months, impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, risking exposure every single day. And all of this was done not for personal gain, but because Voldemort had ordered it. Crouch didn't question the complexity of the mission, or why Voldemort needed a student in the Triwizard Tournament. That kind of strategic knowledge was far above him. He was a vessel, not a planner. And when the moment came, he followed through, placing Harry's name in the Goblet of Fire, guiding him through the tasks and ensuring that he would touch the Triwizard Cup and be transported to the graveyard. Crouch never needed to know why. The fact that he was moving according to the Dark Lord's design was reason enough. Others who questioned the Dark Lord's motives rarely lasted long. Regulus Black learned that the hard way. At first, he had joined the Death Eaters out of youthful arrogance, drawn in by the glamour and power. But when he began to question the morality of Voldemort's actions, especially after witnessing the torture of Kreacher, the house elf, he made the fatal mistake of thinking for himself. He plotted to steal one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, replacing it with a fake. He never returned. His death was never confirmed, but his room remained untouched. His memory faded, his name a ghost. Regulus's fall was a warning written in silence. Those who ask questions disappear. Even among the inner circle, Voldemort shared only what was needed. Severus Snape, perhaps his most complex servant, lived in a state of constant deception. Voldemort believed Snape to be his loyal subject, but never trusted him fully. He gave Snape orders, expected results, but never explanations. And Snape, to his credit, understood the game. He never demanded reasons. Instead, He learned to navigate Voldemort's expectations with careful ambiguity. When Voldemort ordered him to inform him if Harry Potter showed signs of magical instability, Snape did not argue or ask why. He complied outwardly. Inwardly, of course, he was playing a far deeper game, but the fact remains, his survival depended on never challenging Voldemort directly. The moment Snape became inquisitive, Voldemort would begin to doubt him. And doubt, in Voldemort's eyes, was a precursor to death. The deeper truth behind Voldemort's secrecy was simple. His plan was built on layers of mistrust. He believed that no one but himself was capable of holding the full vision. "There is no good and evil," he once told Quirrell. "There is only power, and those too weak to seek it." That philosophy extended to his followers. He saw them not as comrades, but as instruments. A wand doesn't question its master, a potion doesn't ask why it's being brewed, and a Death Eater who dared wonder why quickly ceased to be useful or ceased to be altogether. Even Lucius Malfoy, proud and ambitious, suffered for his failure to act without question. When he botched the mission at the Department of Mysteries, allowing the prophecy to be destroyed, Voldemort's punishment was not a beating. It was humiliation. Lucius was cast aside, stripped of influence, his home violated. Voldemort placed Draco in harm's way, assigning him an impossible task at Hogwarts, not because Draco could succeed, but because Lucius had to watch. Lucius had believed himself more than a tool, a thinker, a strategist, but that was his error. The Dark Lord needed tools, not minds. In the Deathly Hallows, when Voldemort ordered the search for the Elder Wand, his fury at failure was not directed at a single person. It was diffuse, scattered, paranoid. He questioned everyone's loyalty, not their understanding. The irony is that the Elder Wand's power depended on understanding its history, but Voldemort, blinded by dominance, dismissed that need. He sought brute possession, not insight, and thus he missed the critical detail, that the wand's allegiance lay not with him, but with Harry. A wand, too, perhaps, resists a master who does not listen. The most chilling aspect of Voldemort's leadership was not the cruelty, but the absence of explanation. His cruelty was visible, almost predictable. But his refusal to explain, to clarify, created a climate of madness. Followers never knew if they were winning or failing. The mission could be a trap. Success could lead to envy. Failure could mean death. There were no rules, only obedience. It wasn't enough to fight for him. One had to abandon the very need to understand. That was the real loyalty test. Peter Pettigrew is perhaps the most tragic example. He surrendered everything to Voldemort, not out of belief, but out of fear, and Voldemort used him accordingly, sending him on errands, mocking him, mutilating him by giving him a silver hand. When that hand eventually killed him for hesitating to help Harry, it was Voldemort's perfect message to all. Even your own loyalty will betray you if it isn't absolute. The hand, enchanted by Voldemort, had been created to enforce a rule. Do not waver, do not think, do not question. When Peter paused to show mercy, he violated the rule. The hand acted, it crushed his throat without hesitation. This philosophy extended even to Voldemort's manipulations of the giants and werewolves. He made promises, hinted at power, gave them commands. But he never shared the vision. He didn't recruit believers, and he collected pawns. Greyback, the savage werewolf, may have relished blood, but he never knew Voldemort's endgame. And he didn't need to. Voldemort didn't care whether his pawns understood. He cared only that they moved when told. In the final battle at Hogwarts, the cracks in this system became clear. Many Death Eaters fled when the tide turned. Why? Because they had never believed in the mission. They didn't know the mission. They had obeyed out of fear. And fear, while powerful, is brittle. When Voldemort fell, his rule and its central commandment crumbled with him. The moment the master vanished, the tools scattered. To be a follower of Voldemort was to erase yourself, not just your morals, your loyalties, your fears, but even your thoughts. The rule was simple and absolute: never ask why, never seek the greater purpose. A Death Eater's job was not to think, a Death Eater's job was to act. Like a curse, cast without words, the effect was brutal, invisible, and total. And in the end, it destroyed not just their victims, but their very capacity to be human. Number 24, use unforgivable curses without hesitation. In the darkest corners of Voldemort's ideology, there was a rule, unspoken yet absolute, a standard by which all his followers were judged. It was not loyalty, for loyalty could be faked. It was not blood purity, for even that could be used as a tool. No, the real test, the true mark of Death Eater worthiness, was the readiness to cast the unforgivable curses without hesitation. Avada Kedavra, Cruciatus, and Imperius were not merely tools of terror. They were the doctrine of Voldemort-made spell. To flinch in the moment of execution, to hesitate before unleashing one's will upon another soul, such weakness was seen as treason. Voldemort did not tolerate treason. Bellatrix Lestrange was the embodiment of this brutal creed. Her devotion to the Dark Lord was unquestioned, but it was her fluency in cruelty that elevated her in his ranks. She used the Cruciatus curse not only as a weapon, but as a form of communication, an extension of her twisted sense of art. When she tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom into madness, it wasn't an act of necessity, it was a declaration. The level of detail in that sadism was horrifying. Bellatrix didn't simply break their minds. She peeled them apart layer by layer with a confidence that bordered on ecstasy. And Voldemort approved, because in her he saw a follower who understood the sacred nature of mercilessness. In contrast, there was Regulus Black, a name spoken rarely, yet a lesson in contradiction. A pure blood, raised in a family steeped in supremacy, Regulus initially embraced Voldemort's vision. But he lacked one thing, the emotional steel to enforce it. When the moment came to commit fully, to kill without remorse, Regulus could not do it. The cruelty expected of him haunted his conscience, and that was his doom. He died not as a hero, but as a failed follower, quietly undone by his inability to become what Voldemort demanded, a man of merciless action. The Imperius Curse, perhaps the subtlest of the three, required a special kind of detachment. It was not enough to control another's body. The caster had to silence their own empathy, erase any trace of ethical conflict. Barty Crouch Jr., impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, demonstrated this mastery with frightening ease. He used Imperius on students to teach them what it felt like, treating it as a lesson, a spectacle. But behind the performance was an iron will. He did not pause to wonder whether it was right. He believed in control, and control required total domination. Voldemort admired that, because in Barty he saw someone who had shed all human softness. The truth was simple. Voldemort did not believe power came from knowledge. Power, in his world, came from conviction, especially the conviction to harm without restraint. When he returned to a physical form and rallied his scattered followers in the graveyard, he looked into their eyes not for regret or shame, but for the coldness he required. "You return to me," he whispered, "and you prove your faith." It wasn't just presence he demanded, it was proof of transformation. Casting an unforgivable curse wasn't an act, it was a rite. If a follower failed to cross that line, they remained forever unworthy. Draco Malfoy's journey in The Half-Blood Prince is perhaps the most vivid example of this internal war. Hand-picked by Voldemort to assassinate Dumbledore, Draco was given not just a task, but a test of his soul. He had the tools. He had the opportunity. But what he lacked was the emotional readiness to kill. He wavered. He stalled. In the end, it was Severus Snape who cast the fatal spell. That single failure, that moment of hesitation, marked Draco forever. Voldemort knew, and Draco was never truly trusted again. The Dark Lord needed executioners, not boys with trembling hands. There is a reason why the Ministry of Magic outlawed the unforgivable curses, not because they were simply dangerous, but because they demanded a surrender of conscience. To cast Cruciatus effectively, one had to want the victim to suffer. "You need to mean it," said Bellatrix to Harry when he attempted it. "You need to really hate to want to cause pain." That sentence alone reveals everything. Voldemort's rule was not about spellcraft, it was about the psychology of control. Hatred, in his world, was a virtue. Doubt was a sickness. Peter Pettigrew was the weakest of all Voldemort's inner circle, and he was despised for it. Though he delivered Harry's parents to death and revived the Dark Lord with a horrific ritual, Voldemort never truly respected him. The reason? Peter's magic was desperate, never deliberate. He cast under duress, not with joy. When he killed Cedric Diggory, it was mechanical. When he cut his own hand for the potion, he did so with whimpering reluctance. That, to Voldemort, was weakness. Pettigrew was tolerated only as long as he was useful. His end, choked by his own enchanted silver hand for a moment of pity, was the Dark Lord's final judgment. In contrast, Severus Snape understood the expectation, but played a deeper game. He cast the killing curse on Dumbledore without hesitation, and to all the Death Eaters it was the ultimate proof of loyalty. But beneath the surface, Snape's actions were strategic. He did what others could not. He deceived Voldemort while appearing as the perfect servant. Yet even Snape knew the stakes. To hesitate in that moment, on the tower, with Dumbledore pleading, would have destroyed him. Voldemort would have sensed it. So, Snape delivered death with precision, not because he believed, but because he understood the cost of failure. The reason Voldemort valued these spells wasn't simply for their effectiveness. It was because they separated the weak from the strong. The unforgivable curses were a mirror. They reflected the soul of the caster, and Voldemort, who feared death above all, could only trust those who showed no fear at all. He taught that mercy was a delusion, that power could not coexist with doubt. He expected his followers to be emotionally sterile, to become, in effect, reflections of himself. In that cold clarity, he saw safety. During the Battle of Hogwarts, many Death Eaters were undone not by superior magic, but by the simple inability of fear to sustain a cause. When Neville Longbottom stood, bloodied and defiant, to face Voldemort after Harry's seeming death, he showed a strength that no Cruciatus curse could match, the strength of purpose. Voldemort's army, powerful though it was, began to crack, not from outside, but from within. For many, the mask had become unbearable. For others, the moment of truth arrived and they could not cast. Because no matter how many drills or threats, the heart is harder to train than the wand. Amicus and Alecto Caro, for instance, were fanatics of torture. At Hogwarts, under Snape's nominal rule, they used Cruciatus on students, but there was always something performative in their cruelty, something theatrical. In the final battle, faced with true resistance, their spells faltered. Their malice, while real, lacked the religious fervour that Voldemort demanded. They were bullies, not disciples. And Voldemort could sense it. In the end, neither of them earned the immortality they believed they served. Perhaps the clearest expression of Voldemort's standard comes from his confrontation with Harry in the Forbidden Forest. "You have been taught how to duel, Harry Potter?" he asks mockingly. "We bow to each other, Harry." The irony was cruel. For Voldemort there were no rules in combat, only victory, and yet even here he followed the ritual of a duel. But when he cast the killing curse at Harry, there was no hesitation, no pause. That was the difference. Voldemort believed in absolute will, and absolute will demands instant execution. The tragedy of Voldemort's rule was not just in the death it spread, but in the transformation it demanded of his followers. To serve him, one had to amputate parts of the soul. Hesitation was not just weakness, it was rebellion. And so many, in their quest for belonging or power, tried to become something inhuman. Some succeeded and lost their humanity forever. Others failed and paid for it with their lives. And yet, despite all his obsession with control, Voldemort was wrong. Because in the end, the capacity for doubt, for mercy, for love, those were the very things that gave strength to Harry and his allies. Voldemort's rule created followers who feared him, not who believed in him. And fear, unlike faith, cannot last forever. That is why his army crumbled, and that is why when the final spell was cast in the Great Hall, it was not an unforgivable curse that ended the war, but a disarming charm born of conviction, not cruelty. Number 25. Keep secrets even under torture. There was an unspoken code among the followers of Voldemort, a dark commandment etched into their very bones to keep secrets even under torture. This was not a suggestion, but a law, enforced not through formal decree, but through fear, loyalty, and centuries-old dark traditions. To betray this principle was to forfeit one's place in the Dark Lord's world and one's life. Voldemort demanded silence as a sacred offering, and among his ranks it was often whispered that death was far more merciful than the punishment awaiting a traitor. For those who failed to uphold this rule, redemption was not an option. Their loyalty was to be proven with blood, or it would be erased in blood. The Death Eaters were trained not merely in curses and cruelty, but in endurance. The ability to withstand pain without yielding was prized more than magical skill. Bellatrix Lestrange was perhaps the most infamous embodiment of this ideal. After being captured and imprisoned in Azkaban for torturing Frank and Alice Longbottom into madness, she spent 14 years in the Dementor-infested prison and never once spoke Voldemort's name in vain, never revealed a single plan or associate. When she finally broke free during the mass escape in Order of the Phoenix, her loyalty had only intensified. Her silence under torture became legend, a model for all others to emulate. Even the threat of Veritaserum, the truth serum most feared by the wizarding world, was not enough to force the Death Eaters to speak. They were trained to resist its effects through magical countermeasures, mental fortitude, and in some cases, simple brutality. They were told to bite their tongues, break their own jaws if needed, just to avoid betrayal. It was whispered that Antonin Dolohov had once gouged out his own eye with a cursed blade to avoid eye contact during a magical interrogation that relied on legilimency. There was a strange admiration, even reverence, for such acts among Voldemort's inner circle. It wasn't about self-preservation, it was about devotion. The pain did not always come from enemies. Voldemort himself was often the hand that punished those he deemed weak. After the events at the Department of Mysteries, he did not forgive Lucius Malfoy for the failure. The Dark Lord did not kill him, but the punishment was worse. Voldemort took Lucius's son Draco and sent him on a mission he was never meant to survive: assassinate Albus Dumbledore. This was not just vengeance, it was a lesson in consequences. If Lucius could not hold the line, if he let himself be captured and questioned, then he would learn the price of disobedience. Voldemort's message was cruel and unmistakable: your silence or your child. In a secret chamber in the woods outside Little Hangleton, young recruits underwent what they called the Burning Test. Each would be bound, blindfolded, and cursed repeatedly with the Cruciatus curse, not by enemies, but by their own brothers in arms. There were no words spoken during these trials, only screams and, in some cases, defiant silence. Those who could endure an hour were given the mark. Those who cried out secrets or begged for mercy vanished shortly after. Some claimed they were executed, others believed they were handed to inferi for practice. None returned. He who speaks dies was carved into the stone above the door. One of the most disturbing examples of this unbreakable rule came from the case of Thorfinn Rowell. Captured by the Aurors during the Battle of the Seven Potters, Rowell was beaten, burned, and subjected to multiple truth spells. Yet he confessed nothing. When he was later traded in a covert exchange for hostages, he returned to Voldemort's circle, broken but still alive. For a moment the others thought he had been forgiven. But within days his corpse was discovered in Knockturn Alley, his tongue cut out, a dark mark carved into his chest. Some said Voldemort had done it himself, believing Raoul had considered betraying him. Even suspicion was enough. Severus Snape's double life only deepens the cruelty of this rule. Though he served Dumbledore, he remained embedded within Voldemort's inner ranks. His every moment was a test of loyalty, an act of silence. Any slip of the tongue could have brought his death. He watched as others were punished for whispers, while he mastered the art of surviving without speaking more than necessary. It was no accident that Voldemort called him one of the most accomplished Occlumens. The silence Snape maintained was not only magical, it was strategic, honed through years of terror. Even under Voldemort's direct gaze, Snape revealed nothing. It was not bravery, but necessity. Karkaroff was the counter-example, the cautionary tale whispered among the Death Eaters. He had once stood in front of the Wizengamot and betrayed several names to avoid Azkaban. Though he gained temporary freedom, he lived the rest of his days, hunted and despised. Voldemort never forgave him. When the Dark Lord returned, Karkaroff fled. But hiding from Voldemort was like hiding from death. It came slowly, then all at once. His body was found in a shack in the north, covered in frost and curses, the dark mark blazing over his heart. It was the sentence for a traitor, carried out without trial. The silence rule extended even to family. A wife could not know where her husband went at night. A father could not tell his son why he disappeared for days. Secrets were survival, and Voldemort demanded them as offerings. Narcissa Malfoy lied to Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest, telling him Harry was dead. It was a betrayal by omission, a flicker of maternal love breaking through the doctrine of silence. She was lucky, or perhaps clever enough, to twist it in her favor. Had Voldemort known her intent, her body would have burned beside those of the others who had failed. Rabastan Lestrange, brother of Rodolphus, was another stone-faced example of the silent Death Eater. Even after Azkaban drained him to a shadow, his lips never parted with secrets. When he was released and rejoined the Dark Lord, he walked with a limp and spoke only when spoken to. He had memorized the old rule: the fewer the words, the deeper the loyalty. He was not powerful, not strategic, but he was dependable in one crucial way: he would die before he spoke. Voldemort didn't need brilliance. He needed shadows that bled in silence. Even the younger recruits, often less disciplined, were bound by this iron rule. When Yaxley was arrested briefly after the fall of the Ministry, his cell was flooded with truth spells, invasive charms, and even a brief attempt at legilimency. But he had trained for this. He clamped his teeth so tightly that one shattered. He focused on a burning memory Voldemort had given him, a warning more than a lesson. When he was released, he didn't speak of what had happened. He simply returned to his duties, more silent than ever. There were scars across his neck that looked like self-inflicted wounds. Whether they were or not, no one asked. What made this rule even more chilling was that Voldemort did not need to remind his followers of it often. It was so deeply woven into the culture of the Death Eaters that even newcomers obeyed without question. Breaking under pressure was seen not only as weakness but as treason. They feared exposure more than death. In Half-Blood Prince, when Dumbledore says, "You are brave to be here," to Snape, he isn't just referring to spying. He is acknowledging the unrelenting tension, the weight of silence that was expected in the enemy's house. The paradox of this rule is that it made Voldemort's regime simultaneously powerful and fragile. It created loyalty bound in terror, but it also meant information was compartmentalized. Death Eaters often didn't know what the others were doing. They couldn't warn each other, couldn't communicate freely. Voldemort ruled a kingdom of whispers where everyone feared the consequences of speech. It made betrayal hard to detect and even harder to prevent. But it also meant that one leak could be catastrophic and that paranoia would always fester. Even in death, the code endured. Mulciber, who died in the final battle, was found with curse burns across his hands, suggesting he'd fought to the bitter end. His body bore the same markings as others who had passed the burning test. He had not betrayed a soul. His death was not noble, but it was useful. Voldemort needed martyrs of silence, corpses that inspired fear and awe. To die with clenched teeth was to be remembered as worthy. To die crying out secrets was to be erased. Perhaps the most devastating thing about this rule is that it worked. The Ministry, the Order of the Phoenix, even Dumbledore himself, never knew the full extent of Voldemort's network. Many plans went uninterrupted because the captured Death Eaters simply said nothing. Voldemort may have been a monster, but he understood something essential about power. Secrets are weapons, and silence is the shield that guards them. Those who wore his mark were not just soldiers, they were vaults, sealed by agony, guarded by fear. And when the time came, they were expected to burn in silence. Number 26. Respect Nagini. Nagini slithered silently through the dim corridors of Malfoy Manor, her emerald scales catching the flickering light of the torches like polished gemstones. Her presence alone was enough to silence any murmur of dissent. No one dared meet her eyes. No one dared move when she curled at the foot of Voldemort's chair, her coils resting in a loose spiral, her head poised as if listening to every heartbeat in the room. For the Death Eaters, Nagini was not merely a snake. She was a living extension of the Dark Lord, a sacred being, and to regard her with anything less than reverence was to risk the wrath of the one whose very name they feared to utter. It was a rule unspoken but deeply understood. Nagini was to be honored as though she were the Dark Lord himself. When Bellatrix Lestrange knelt before Voldemort during the meeting at the manor, she cast a quick glance at the serpent before bowing her head lower. She did not speak of Nagini aloud. She did not comment on her beauty or strength. She simply lowered herself further, allowing her silence to communicate a reverence that words could never express. Bellatrix, the most loyal of all Death Eaters, knew that to speak of the serpent casually would have been akin to sacrilege. Even her fanatical devotion had its limits, and one of those was the rule of the snake. At the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, Lucius Malfoy had caught a fleeting glimpse of Nagini before the chaos erupted. The serpent had been coiled loosely around the Dark Lord's ankles during a brief appearance, her tongue flicking as she sensed the air. Lucius, dishevelled and frantic as he was, still found time to bow his head when Voldemort turned, acknowledging both master and serpent. It was not fear alone that motivated him, it was doctrine. In the ranks of the Death Eaters, Nagini had become more than a creature. She was dogma, a sacred commandment slithering beside them. The reverence owed to Nagini was more than symbolic. She was, in the truest sense, a vessel of power. Unknown to many of the Death Eaters, but suspected by the more observant, she held within her something no other beast could claim, a fragment of Voldemort's soul. The connection was tangible. When she struck, it was with his malice. When she watched, it was with his suspicion. When she killed, it was with his hatred. Daring to mistreat Nagini meant daring to wound the Dark Lord himself. Even Severus Snape, the ever-cautious spy, moved carefully in her presence, calculating his steps so as not to draw her gaze. During the imprisonment of Charity Burbage, Nagini was more than a bystander. Her presence in the room was a silent threat. As the Muggle Studies professor dangled helplessly, Voldemort merely gestured, and Nagini responded with horrifying obedience. She glided to her prey and consumed her as the Death Eaters watched, in a silence thick with tension. None commented on the grotesque display. None looked away, as they knew better. The message was clear. Nagini was executioner, enforcer, and emissary. To flinch at the sight of her feeding was to insult the will of the Dark Lord. There were moments, though fleeting, when even hardened Death Eaters struggled to mask their unease. Peter Pettigrew once winced when Nagini brushed against his ankle, and though Voldemort said nothing, the glance he gave was enough to remind Wormtail of his place. The rat-like man stammered an apology, not to Voldemort, but to the snake, and retreated. He knew that his fear had been a mistake, that his revulsion had betrayed something unforgivable. Nagini was not to be feared as an animal. She was to be feared as a priest might fear a vengeful god. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Frank Bryce, the old caretaker, encountered Voldemort and Nagini at the Riddle House, the snake had been moving through the hall like a ghost. The snake! The snake! "She's coming," Voldemort had whispered, and there was something reverent in his voice, almost intimate. Nagini slid across the floor and paused near the hearth, her form merging with the shadows. For Frank, the moment was eerie. For Voldemort, it was natural. He trusted her. He confided in her. She was the only creature in his life that had earned the title of companion without ever saying a word. This bond made her untouchable. Her proximity to Voldemort meant she was always near the seat of power, always witnessing decisions of life and death. When Voldemort interrogated traitors, she was there. When he punished weakness, she slithered silently in the background. Her presence was not merely for intimidation. She was a participant. And sometimes she was the verdict. Her attack on Arthur Weasley within the Department of Mysteries, though orchestrated through Voldemort's connection to Harry, had the elegance of a blade wielded by a master assassin. The snake! It was guarding something, Harry had gasped upon waking, and though he did not yet understand the connection, the symbolism was profound. Nagini guarded secrets. She guarded power. Among the Death Eaters, respect for Nagini evolved into ritualistic behavior. It was said that before important missions, senior followers like Yaxley or Travers would seek the blessing of the Dark Lord by kneeling in the presence of both Master and Serpent. Some even whispered phrases in Parseltongue, mimicking the language that bound Voldemort to his companion. They believed it offered protection, and perhaps it did, for Voldemort seemed to favor those who did not flinch when Nagini slithered close. The deaths of Bathilda Bagshot and later Severus Snape revealed how deeply Nagini's role had grown. In Godric's Hollow, she lured Harry into a trap, hiding within Bathilda's corpse. The grotesque ingenuity of it was uniquely Voldemort's, but the execution was Nagini's. She acted not like a beast, but like a soldier. And in the Deathly Hallows, when Voldemort ordered Snape's death, it was Nagini who delivered the fatal blow. She struck through enchanted glass, a display of control and loyalty so complete that it left no doubt. Nagini did not merely serve the Dark Lord, she was his will. Even the most powerful Death Eaters watched her with cautious respect. Dolohov, who had survived battles against the Order, never turned his back to Nagini. Rookwood, once a Ministry insider, gave her a wide berth. There was no room for arrogance in her presence. She was above them all in the hierarchy, second only to Voldemort. And they knew that her loyalty was unshakable. Her death would later symbolize the unraveling of Voldemort's power, not just because she was a Horcrux, but because she had been the last creature that still believed in him. In the final hours of the Battle of Hogwarts, when Neville Longbottom severed Nagini's head with the sword of Gryffindor, the room seemed to exhale. The spell of reverence was broken. Blood soaked the floor, and the coils that had once choked the life from so many now lay lifeless. Voldemort's scream was not just one of loss. It was one of betrayal, of desecration. His final commandment had been violated. The rule that had governed his followers had been shattered. Nagini had been his last ally, the one creature he had trusted completely. To the Death Eaters, her presence had always meant safety, as long as she did not turn her gaze toward them. With her gone, the illusion of Voldemort's invincibility dissolved. The rule of respect, once carved into every look and gesture, crumbled in silence. And the followers who had once bowed before her now fled in fear, their master reduced to a man, no longer a myth. To understand the world of Voldemort is to understand that his power was not just in curses or terror, but in symbols. Nagini was the most sacred of those. She was the law that walked without legs, the rule that hissed in the dark, the god that could kill without warning. Those who served the Dark Lord did so under her gaze, and they knew with unshakable certainty that to disrespect her was to invite a death both swift and sacred. Number 27. Do not seek forgiveness. Rodolphus Lestrange knew what it meant to fail. When the mission to capture the Longbottoms had ended in blood and ruin, he was not granted a moment of respite, not a word of comfort from the Dark Lord. Azkaban was not a punishment Voldemort had chosen for them. It was simply the logical consequence of their incompetence. And yet even in that cold fortress, Rodolphus did not beg for forgiveness. He did not dream of absolution. In the eyes of the Dark Lord, the only path to redemption was through violence, victory, or death. The idea of seeking mercy was so foreign, so repugnant to the ideology of the Death Eaters, that it bordered on blasphemy. Voldemort had built his empire on domination, not redemption. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps the most fanatical of all his followers, epitomized this principle. She never doubted, never wavered, and never asked for anything. Her loyalty was fierce because it was grounded not in love or understanding, but in worship of power. When she killed Sirius Black, it was not merely an act of hatred, it was a reaffirmation of her commitment to the only law Voldemort respected, strength without remorse. She screamed with glee, not because she enjoyed the kill, but because she had fulfilled her duty. And when she later duelled Molly Weasley and died in battle, she met her end without fear or tears. To die fighting for the Dark Lord was, in her mind, the highest form of atonement. Regulus Black offered a quiet rebellion, a whispered betrayal rather than open confrontation. But even he did not beg for Voldemort's understanding. When he discovered the true nature of the Horcruxes, he knew the price of disobedience. He did not run, he did not confess, he simply acted and died. His silence was not cowardice, but a final nod to the rule he had once followed. You do not explain yourself to the Dark Lord. You either serve flawlessly or you fall. Regulus's death was not just a protest, it was a burial of his own identity, a rejection of both redemption and recognition. He took the truth to the grave because in Voldemort's world, confessions were not currency, they were weakness. Severus Snape, perhaps the most complicated of them all, also understood the weight of this law. His double allegiance to Dumbledore and Voldemort was a dance on a knife's edge, but even in moments of great peril, when his life dangled by a thread, Snape never sought Voldemort's forgiveness. He knew it would not be given. The day Voldemort killed Lily Potter was the day Snape's soul split in two, but not even then did he fall to his knees in front of the Dark Lord. Instead, he redirected his guilt, transformed it into usefulness, masked it with cold precision. Voldemort didn't want sorrow, he wanted utility, and Snape provided it until the very end. In Voldemort's eyes, Snape's usefulness was the only absolution that mattered. Once that utility expired, so did he. Voldemort despised apologies because they were rooted in emotion, and emotion was the language of the weak. He had watched his father abandon his mother, seen the shame of her desperation, and carved from that childhood the conviction that begging leads only to betrayal. Forgiveness was a tool for fools, a weapon for those too weak to wield real power. In his ideology, a soldier's mistake was a blemish on the whole machine. The only way to restore order was through punishment or blood, and thus fear was welded into the bones of every Death Eater. Peter Pettigrew, the coward in the corner, serves as the perfect example of what Voldemort abhorred. He begged, he pleaded, he grovelled at every turn. When Voldemort returned, in the graveyard, and Pettigrew fell to his knees, offering his hand and his service, Voldemort accepted him not out of forgiveness, but out of necessity. He used him because Pettigrew was expendable. "You returned to me," Voldemort said, "not out of loyalty, but out of fear." And when Pettigrew's debt was paid, when his usefulness waned, Voldemort ensured that even the mercy Pettigrew once showed, his brief hesitation to kill Harry, became the instrument of his own death. The silver hand crushed his throat, an execution ordered long before the hesitation had even begun. There was no room for mercy. Not even from the betrayer to the betrayed. Lucius Malfoy, once proud and powerful, learned the cost of disgrace in silence. After the debacle at the Department of Mysteries, he returned to Voldemort, a broken man. But he did not ask for forgiveness. He knew better. His punishment came in the form of lost favour, public humiliation, and the slow disintegration of his family's influence. Voldemort seized control of the Malfoy manor, used it as a base, and treated Lucius as a mere shell of his former self. The wand he once wielded with pride was confiscated, his son was endangered, his wife was manipulated, and Lucius, trapped between fear and failure, could do nothing. Not once did he ask for another chance. He knew it would never be given. Narcissa Malfoy, in contrast, broke the rule, but only in the most subtle of ways. She lied to the Dark Lord. She claimed Harry was dead, not to betray Voldemort, but to save her son. And she did not ask for permission. She did not explain herself. She acted. This was the only way to survive under Voldemort's rule, not by asking for forgiveness, but by never getting caught. Her lie was wrapped in quiet rebellion, but even that required strength. Had he known, Voldemort would have destroyed her without a second thought. Mercy was not an option. Loyalty meant obedience, and anything else was treason. Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, exemplified perfect service until the moment he was exposed. His mission had been a masterpiece of deception. But when his identity unraveled, he didn't try to justify his mistakes. He knew the rule. There was no court, no trial, no chance to plead. He was taken away in silence, his eyes wide with a fanatic's understanding that failure is death and only success is survival. Even his madness did not exempt him from the law of Voldemort. There was no redemption arc for Barty Crouch Jr., only a shadow consumed by the ideology he worshipped.